When I was a kid, there was one thing that everyone wanted to do that really showcased our athletic ability and coolness. And that was being able to posterize a dude, to throw down, to tomahawk, to honey dip, to phi slamma jamma, to slam dunk a basketball, in case it wasn't clear. Look, it might be one of the most identifiable moves in sports, and it is something that the world at large can recognize and aspire to. Because let's be real, in theory, anyone can be taught the fundamentals of basketball. How to pull off an effective pick and roll, how to hit your cutting teammate with a perfect bounce pass as he swoops to the basket, and of course how to hit a three-point shot from the corner. Spoilers, you're still never going to do it as well as Steph Curry, but points for trying. The fundamentals are teachable. And because they're so teachable, maybe someone will get around to teaching the stars of the NBA today about those fundamentals. Hey-o! But the slam dunk is the great cutoff, if you will. Because though everyone thinks they can dunk a basketball, that simply isn't true. Sure, some people are able to basically scrape the rim and gently put the ball in the hoop with extraordinary effort, and that's technically a dunk, but it isn't a slam dunk. That act of athletic insanity is reserved for that rare breed of player who seems to exist solely to remind the rest of us mere mortals that, while we might be playing the same game as them, we really aren't playing the same game as them. Not really. It's a move that inspires awe, inspiration, and plenty of jokes at the expense of the poor fool who's standing underneath the person who throws down with no regard for human life. And yet, as amazing as it is, can you imagine if it was illegal? That would be wild, right? No one would do that, right? Right? I'm Mike GW, and you're listening to Surreal Sports Stories. Now, in order to understand, really, the significance of the slam dunk, you have to know a thing or two about the development of professional basketball in the United States. If you really want to stretch, you could make an argument that the first instance of organized basketball, or at least a game that closely resembles it, was recorded as far back as 1541? Dang, talk about ancient history. And it's not even a source from the United States. It's from a book published in Frankfurt, Germany, whose name I am not going to try to pronounce, I'm not that far on Duolingo, that roughly translates to True Counterfeitment of the Savages in America. The book describes a game of skill where there's a target woven together from twigs sitting high on a pole in the middle of a playing field, and players have to throw balls into the target up high. You get points if you hit the target. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Honestly, it's more of a cross between disc golf and basketball maybe if you squint your eyes hard enough, but it gets the idea across, I suppose. Also, given the time period this was written and the unfortunate usage of the word savages by the author in describing the natives at play, this seems to be evidence as far back as 1541 that white men can't jump. But I digress. Now, the game of basketball that we all know has its roots in Springfield, Massachusetts. That's where, in December of 1891, a man by the name of Dr. James Naismith worked his magic. Naismith was a PE teacher at the local YMCA International Training School, today at Springfield College, who wanted to find a way to keep the boys in shape during the winter months. Specifically, his boss at the YMCA asked that he create an indoor game that should be, quote, fair for all players and not too tough, end quote. Naismith, with the help of some peach baskets and a soccer-esque ball, fashioned a game basically on the spot. There were a few differences between Naismith's original form of the game and the modern method, though. For starters, OG basketball had teams of 9 players on each side, not 5 like today. And the peach baskets that players had to throw the ball into still had their bottoms, so anytime a player scored, the janitor had to bring out a ladder and get the ball out of the basket before play could resume. Eventually they just cut the bottoms out. Now in the beginning, there were only 13 rules to Naismith's game. Eventually the game would expand to a lot more rules and sub-rules, but don't worry, the players still don't listen to any of them. Especially not the rule about traveling. Anyway, interestingly, as Naismith's game started to pick up in popularity, the game really started to find its original roots in the international community. See, Naismith worked for the YMCA when he made the game, and the YMCA at the turn of the 20th, 19th century was a pretty big cultural force. It was thanks to the YMCA that the first European basketball match took place in 1893 in Paris. Soon after, games were played in China, India, Japan, and Persia, today Iran. During the First World War, as the U.S. Army started fighting, the American Expeditionary Force, which is what we called our army during the war, took basketball wherever they could. Sort of playground diplomacy, I guess, if you will. Even Dr. Naismith was in France with the YMCA, spreading the good word of basketball to Europe, as the leaders of his country were trying to spread the good word of democracy, when they weren't trying to punish Germany, I guess. Over the next couple of decades, as the international community created a governing body for basketball that is still in operation today, the International Basketball Federation, or FIBA, the United States was still kind of patching together regional and local leagues. The first league in the U.S. was formed in 1898 and folded by 1904. The next league wasn't really a league more than a traveling circus, and it wasn't until the 1940s that two separate leagues of pro basketball, the Basketball Association of America and the National Basketball League, merged together in 1949. The new joint league would be known as the National Basketball Association, and it has remained the biggest basketball league in the world ever since. But you didn't come here just for a history lesson on basketball. You came here to hear about dunks. Slam dunks. So let's get to it. We actually have the first recorded instances of a slam dunk in 1936. Now again, maybe not the first to literally do it, but the first recorded case. The man who has the honor? Joe Fortenberry, who was a captain for America's basketball team in the Olympics that year. That was the first year to have basketball in the Olympics. And in case that year is ringing a bell, yes, that would be the 1936 Olympics that Nazi Germany ran, where Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. But that's another story. Now, fun fact, Fortenberry was the high scorer in the gold medal game that year, scoring a whopping 8 points in a blowout 19-8 victory in a game held outdoors on a clay court in the rain. Think about that the next time you're sitting in one of those multi-billion-dollar stadiums. Now, Fortenberry might not have been the first to literally dunk a basketball, but he was the first to get seen doing it by a reporter. Arthur Daly, who was a Pulitzer-winning sports writer for the New York Times, wrote an article in March 1936 describing Fortenberry's move in, I gotta be honest with you, possibly the most delightfully ridiculous, look at me, I'm a writer, analogy I've ever heard. According to Daly, Fortenberry jumped up and, quote, pitched the ball downward into the hoop, much like a cafeteria customer dunking a roll in coffee, end quote. That absolutely sounds like someone who lives in New York making an analogy based on one of the many, many delis and breakfast places that pockmark the streets of the 5 boroughs. To all my New York listeners, hi guys, hi gals, I love your city. Now, Fortenberry wasn't the only guy doing this, and that might have been more of a one-off thing than anything else, because the first guy to consistently dunk in games was one Bob Kurland. Kurland was a 7-foot-tall center who, while in college for Oklahoma A&M, now Oklahoma State, from 1942 to 1946, became the first player credited with dunking consistently in college games. Don't worry, it's not like Kurland and Fortenberry were the only guys who could do it. In the 1950s, Jim Pollard, nicknamed the Kangaroo Kid, would mess around in practice by dunking from the free throw line, roughly 20 years before Dr. J. Julius Erving became a legend for doing just that in games. As one of Pollard's contemporaries put it, quote, "We knew when Pollard had been in the building. The tops of the backboards would be clean where he raked them," end quote. But you're probably wondering why there's only like 3 names popping up over those first 20 or so years. And there's a simple reason why, despite the fact that basically the majority of players in the league could dunk, but didn't. And that answer is male fragility. Well, maybe a little bit more than that. See, defenders felt like a slam dunk wasn't an exciting way to score. It was showboating, and it was showing them up. And if you showed someone up, you'd better be ready for a little retribution. Kurland's contemporary big man of the era, George Mikan, remarked that in his day, quote, "We used to dunk in pregame practice, not in the game," end quote. Meanwhile, Satch Sanders, a player for the Boston Celtics from 1960 to 1973, was even more direct. According to Sanders, quote, In the old days, defenders would run under you while you were in the air, trying to take people out of games so they couldn't play. It was an unwritten rule." End quote. For those of you who can't picture it, it is super dangerous to try to cut someone's legs out from under them when they are in midair. So because of that threat, most players in the 1940s, the 1950s, and even into the 1960s just didn't dunk. But that was all going to change. And it was basically going to change because of, almost literally, one man. He stood 7'1" and weighed a powerful 275 pounds. He was nicknamed the Stilt, which he hated, and the Big Dipper, which he loved. His name was Wilt Chamberlain, and he was going to help revolutionize the game of basketball. Now, Chamberlain was probably one of the first big deal prospects in American sports, the type of athlete that we pay attention to as a nation back when they're still in high school or even younger. Now, I found an article from the autumn 2005 edition of Kansas History, a journal of the Central Plains, that dives into Wilt's influence in the game, and it's kind of crazy how good he was. The man, being so big and so tall, was more or less a cheat code. In high school, his team won 58 games and only lost 3. They won the city championship back-to-back years, and his senior year, he averaged 47.2 points a game. Some high schools don't even put up 47 points in a game. To give you an idea of how hyped Chamberlain's presence made people, when he was on the freshman team at the University of Kansas, the coach of the varsity team, Phog Allen, who is the namesake of the Jayhawks Stadium and one of the greatest coaches in college basketball history, had a miserable year coaching varsity and was only buoyed by the hope of coaching Wilt on the varsity team his sophomore year. But then, Phog Allen turned 70. And that was the year that at the time, all Kansas state employees had to submit their retirement. Being the head coach of a public university in the state meant that Phog Allen was a public employee. And he was desperate. He begged the University Board of Regents to just give him one more year, no more, just so he could say that he coached Wilt. It was a move so hot button in the area that even the Kansas State House of Representatives proposed a resolution requesting that the university keep him another year. The Board of Regents would deny his request, but still, Wilt was so good and so hyped that he nearly triggered a change in state law about mandatory retirement ages. Now, outside of the political impact, Wilt would dominate in college, and then he would go on to dominate in the NBA. Currently, he holds 72 personal NBA records, including several in scoring, rebounding, and unofficially in blocked shots, because they didn't really start counting blocks until later. Now, the ins and outs of Wilt's dominance, as well as some of his personal insecurities, he was obsessed with not fouling out of a game, so he literally never fouled out in his entire NBA career. But some of his teammates resented that he'd stop playing as hard if he was approaching the magic number. All of that's worthy of another episode. But the main thing to note today about Wilt is that, well, he was incredible at slam dunks, even in college. And it was starting to rustle the jimmies of a lot of old head fans. See, one of the key pieces of basketball is shooting free throws when you've been fouled. Being able to hit a free throw seems like it should be automatic points, but not everyone is known for their ability to hit those gimmies. Looking at you, Shaq. Wilt was never a great free throw shooter, but he did find a loophole. In college, when he was at the free throw line, Wilt would just jump from the free throw line and dunk his free shots. I'm going to repeat that because it still boggles my mind. Wilt Chamberlain was so athletic and so tall that he could jump from the free throw line without a running start and still be able to dunk a free throw. Now, opposing coaches, when they would hear about this feat, were apparently so terrified at the thought that they brought it up at the 1956 NCAA convention to complain. And the NCAA listened. After that convention, a new rule was made that players had to keep both of their feet behind the free throw line when taking their free throw shot. The NBA would adopt that rule later, and it has remained to this day. That wasn't the only rule that seemed to be written in a seemingly vague way, but conveniently targeted Chamberlain. In 1957, Wilt's sophomore year, the NCAA struck again with another rule change. See, Kansas had figured out a delightful little trick, according to that Kansas Journal article I've been quoting from. Quote, During Wilt's sophomore year, Kansas developed an inbounds play where a teammate lobbed the ball over the backboard to Chamberlain. The NCAA subsequently banned inbound passes from under the backboard. End quote. Slowly but surely, the rules were being expanded and stretched to basically prevent Chamberlain from going full Chamberlain. That wasn't to say that he wasn't still dunking. Anytime he did, it was called a dipper dunk. But Chamberlain was very acutely aware of the fact that everything he did was scrutinized. According to that article in Kansas History, quote, he was the sport's first celebrity, subject to unprecedented levels of fascination and criticism. The New York Amsterdam News, Pittsburgh Courier, and Chicago Defender considered him a young black folk hero. Sports Illustrated and Sporting News marveled at his prowess. Time, Newsweek, and the New York Times profiled his college experience. Jimmy Breslin wrote the long feature for Saturday Evening Post. Life chronicled his recruitment by Kansas. Reporters from national magazines roamed press row at Allen Fieldhouse. End quote. And that was just in college. Look, there's no getting around it, so I'm just going to come out and say it. The rise of the slam dunk in basketball was coming at about the same time that sports, both collegiate and professional, were integrating. And while some sports were all in favor of it, and some folks were all in favor of it, others kinda had to be dragged kicking and screaming to the new era. And as sports got blacker, it sure seemed like there was a rash of rule changes popping up at the same time, all conveniently targeting aspects of the game that black players were more commonly using than white players. Now, Wilt Chamberlain might have been breaking some racial barriers in Lawrence, Kansas while he was in college, but even his friends and contemporaries would be the first to tell you that Wilt was no civil rights agitator. The racial barriers he did break were on individual levels, not necessarily on a grand social scale. In time, as the Kansas Journal wrote, quote, his personality and philosophy demanded that the public consider him as more than a basketball player or a black man. Wilt Chamberlain could not be reduced to either symbol or caricature. End quote. But he was definitely aware. Oftentimes, Wilt would favor finger roll shots in college as opposed to the dunk shot, almost as if he was trying to avoid being stereotyped any more than he already was as a large black man in a game that was rapidly integrating. But whether he wanted to or not, he's the one who got the ball rolling, and the 1960s would just pick it up. The 60s were a time of great social unrest and upheaval in the United States. To put it mildly. And in basketball, there were some pretty big changes to boot. Take the year 1966, when a scrappy Texas Western team, now the University of Texas El Paso, shocked the world by defeating the juggernaut Kentucky Wildcats for the NCAA. Texas Western had made history that year and were shocking not just for having won the title, they were the first team to start an all-black lineup in college basketball. And the team was big into slam dunks. The dunk was very much encouraged by their coach, Don Haskins. As former TW player Orsten Artis remembered, quote, Haskins was very strict about some things. You couldn't go behind your back or between your legs, but he loved the dunk, end quote. Unfortunately, Haskins seemed to be an island when it came to that, because other coaches, like Kentucky's legendary Adolph Rupp, were less than thrilled by something that they felt was an affront to the game. Now, was the affront the dunk, or was it the sudden influx of black players? I don't know, but I don't know if I want to give a guy named Adolf the benefit of the doubt on this one. Now, Texas Western winning the title in 1966 was a bit of an aberration. They weren't exactly the new star rising in college basketball, and they really haven't been since. But after they won the title, the new kid on the block to be dominant would take over. That would be UCLA, and their new phenom, a young man named Lou Alcindor. Alcindor was quite frankly a freak of nature. By 8th grade, the poor kid was 6'8". That had to be awkward. And he could already dunk. In high school, he was maybe the best basketball player to ever come out of a New York City school. He was so good that Southern college teams were willing to forego their segregationist policies they had in the past if it meant they could get him on their team. He ended up going west and joined UCLA, and during his freshman year at the school, he led the freshman team to a victory over the varsity team in the preseason scrimmage, the first time in school history that had ever happened. It was such a big deal that a write-up from United Press International included this delightfully snarky line, quote, UCLA's Bruins opened defense of their national basketball title this week, but right now, they're only the second best team on campus." End quote. When Alcindor joined the varsity squad for his sophomore season, he scored a mind-melting 56 points in his first game. He would go on to average 29 points a game that season, leading UCLA to an undefeated year and a national title. He'd lead the Bruins to the national title his sophomore, junior, and senior year, and he won the NCAA tournament's Most Outstanding Player award each of those years. He was so good that he made Wilt Chamberlain look like a scrub. But there was another way he was different from Chamberlain, in his thirst for social justice. Alcindor came of age in Harlem during the Harlem Riot of 1964, which was triggered by the shooting of a 15-year-old black boy named James Powell by a New York City police officer. Alcindor wrote many years later that the riot kick-started his interest in racial politics. Quote, "Right then and there, I knew who I was, who I had to be. I was going to be black rage personified, black power in the flesh." End quote. He continued to be an outspoken figure through college, including famously refusing to attend the 1968 Summer Olympics, the year the U.S. won the gold medal, in solidarity with the black civil rights movement, which was reeling in the aftermath of the murders of Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It might have been because of his outspoken nature. It might have been because he was just so damn good. But either way, Alcindor's presence in the college sphere and his dominance within it was gonna force the NCAA's hand. After the 1966-67 season, the year Alcindor won his first title, the NCAA Rules Committee met, as per usual, to discuss any tweaks to the game and rule changes they were interested in. Most were incidental, the type that you don't even notice. But there was one big rule change that was coming down the pike. Starting in the 1967-1968 season, the dunk was banned in college basketball, effective immediately. That's right, the shot that was the bread and butter of Alcindor and so many other players was now illegal. Why? Well, the committee gave a real humdinger of a justification. It tried to make this all about concerns about injury and damaged equipment, claiming, quote, that more than 1,500 players had been injured attempting the shot the previous season, and that countless rims and backboards had been rendered useless. And aesthetically, members said, the dunk was an abomination, end quote. Gotta love how the first two justifications maybe make some sense logistically, and then the committee just shows its hand with the last one and admits that they just don't like the slam dunk. The move was almost immediately panned. In an April 14, 1967 edition of Time magazine, the publication didn't bother to hide its disgust with the move, writing, quote, "First there was the Wilt Chamberlain rule designed to force him away from the basket by widening the 3-second zone in which an offensive player can remain for only 3 seconds at a time. Next came the Bill Russell rule, which forbids blocking a shot when the ball is on its downward course. Now there is the Lou Alcindor rule. College basketball's rules makers decided last week that players may no longer dunk or stuff the ball by ramming it through the hoop from directly above. The no dunking rule was frankly aimed at Alcindor, the 7-foot, 13/8-inch UCLA sophomore who averaged 29 points a game this season while leading his team to a perfect 30-0 record in the NCAA championship." End quote. Time further pointed out the inanity of the rule, remarking that the majority of Alcindor's shots, quote, come on tip-ins, layups, jump shots, and hook shots, all of which are still perfectly legal. It also further pointed out that the rules were counterproductive, as, quote, many experts believe that the new rule actually will hamper shorter men, who use the dunk shot as a means of combating taller defenders like Alcindor. In fact, one of the most prolific dunkers in college basketball last season was Niagara freshman Calvin Murphy, who stands only 5'10". End quote. The anti-dunking rule would colloquially be known as the Lou Alcindor rule, even though some claim that this wasn't the case. Alcindor's longtime coach, the legendary John Wooden, remarked in 2004 that while Alcindor was heated about the change, he himself didn't believe it was the reason, remarking, quote, some on the committee told me that Lewis's name did come up in the discussion, but that he wasn't the reason, end quote. I believe that Wooden believes that. I also believe that the timing, even if totally innocent, is pretty shitty, at least for Alcindor. Not that that stopped him. He just developed a move that would come to define him and his play for the rest of his career. the skyhook, where he would leap up into the air, and instead of trying to stuff the ball into the rim, he would extend his arm up high, higher than anyone could reach, and just sort of loft the ball into the net from far above the rim line. Alcindor would go on to make other changes as well, none more famous than when he was in the NBA in 1971, when he converted to Islam and took on the name that we know him today, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The NCAA's anti-dunking rule would finally be removed in 1976, but the dunk was still viewed with some suspicion even in that decade. It would take the work of graceful aerialists like Dr. J. Julius Erving and Michael Jordan, as well as terrifyingly strong throwdown artists like Daryl Chocolate Thunder Dawkins, to start convincing the fans in the world that dunks were breathtaking. But the final reason to explain why the dunk was no longer so taboo is somewhat more mundane. See, part of the reason why dunks were frowned upon was because of basic physics. Jumping up and pulling down on a metal frame held up by glass with no give more likely than not means you're going to make the backboard explode into a shower of glass. It looks incredible, but it is very, very dangerous. I mean, shards of glass, you know? The solution came from a man named Arthur Uratt, a man who lived in central Illinois and was the operator of a grain elevator. Uratt wasn't a fan of the game, but his nephew was a coach at St. Louis University, and when the younger man asked his uncle if he could come up with something that might make rims safer, Arthur got to tinkering. His solution was kind of brilliant, according to a local write-up. Quote, by rigging a spring from a John Deere cultivator into a hinged base, Uratt invented a rim that had give, but immediately returned to its original position. Uratt filed a patent for this new mechanism in 1976, and its existence helped bring the dunk back to college. In 1978, at the first Final Four after the dunking ban was lifted, the NCAA used his rims, even though John Wooden wasn't an immediate fan. After Daryl Dawkins broke multiple NBA backboards, Uratt's invention got drafted to the pros. End quote. Uratt's design, or at least a variation of it, is still in use today. There have been some other tweaks added here and there, but in the end, modern-day hoops are almost unbreakable. And with every and all possible barriers to its implementation out of the way, the possible racial bias against it having given way to sheer inertia, the slam dunk is here to stay. It remains one of sport's most recognizable moments. Which makes it all the better to me that the man who made it so logistically safe, Arthur Uratt, had this to say in an interview. Quote, honest to pieces, I know practically nothing about the damn game. I pay attention to the dunk. That's the only thing I wait for. End quote. Him and so many more. And you know, maybe one day I'll be able to do it myself. Hey, don't laugh. It's totally doable. All I'm going to need is some good shoes, some stretching beforehand, and an Olympic-grade trampoline. You've been listening to Surreal Sports Stories. Sources for today's episodes include Time Magazine, Biography.com, ESPN.com, The Kansas Journal, MentalFloss.com, The Philadelphia Inquirer, The Chicago Tribune, and many, many more. If you like the show, you can find Surreal Sports Stories wherever you listen to your podcasts. Do us a favor and smash that subscribe button and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your shows. You can also find us on YouTube at Surreal Sports Pod. You can also find me, your intrepid host, Mike GW, on Blue Sky at thewritingirishman.bsky.social and the show on Instagram at Surreal Sports Pod. Head to YouTube or Instagram at Surreal Sports Pod or Blue Sky at thewritingirishman.bsky.social. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. This has been Surreal Sports Stories. You've been amazing, and I've been Mike GW. Stay steady, y'all.